What's up, guys? After a month-long cast time of Powered Update, we finally received a rework for the Dragonflight Priest talent trees. And today I wanted to cover some of those changes as well as a few of the playstyle possibilities we see in the new talents. First up, let's just look at the changes for the Priest class tree from a Shadow Priest perspective. Overall, this class tree honestly looks like one of the better ones for a DPS. Compared to the old tree, this iteration has few nodes that lead directly to throughput, and with many of them towards the center of the tree, you can grab them with plenty of points left for utility options. Being given Shadow Fiend and Death for free for just being Spec Shadow, there are only 13 or so points that are directly dedicated to damage left to grab, 15 if Holy Nova and Rhapsody become strong enough to pick up for an AoE burst. This leaves us with about 16 points to pick up both some of the classic utility and healing options we've already seen, such as Angelic Feather and Shadowman plus Masochism, as well as some new additions we'll talk about later. For our throughput points, we see some of the expected nodes coming back from the first iteration, with 2 points dedicated to Power Infusion and Twins of the Sun Priestess, 2 points each for Twist of Fate, which procs on damage this time around, and improved MindBlast, and 4 points dedicated to Mind Games. Next, we have a few new or modified nodes to round out the last 3 points. Death and Madness has received a change. Now, instead of resetting on enemy death, it will reset when it doesn't take something down in execute range. The key here is that while it reads as an infinite reset, it currently only resets once for 2 total casts per CD. Personally, I would like to see it castable on every mob in execute at least once to mimic that fun reset playstyle it had, but this does still have better single target implications. Next, we have Throes of Pain. A bit of extra damage on Shadowwood Pain with a small bit of insanity gain if the target afflicted by pain dies. Overall, nothing flashy, but still a nice little bit of damage for our dots. And the final throughput option to talk about, and personally my favorite, is a choice node between a shadowy version of Divine Star and Halo. We had these 2 spells as an area option row back in WoD and MoP, and it's great to see Shadow gain access to these iconic pre-spells once more. Though I will still miss Cascade as the only option not brought back, and my personal favorite of the 3. Next, let's look at some of the new utility and defensive options we have available. But first, we have a slight change to one of the small but iconic priest defensives, Fade. Translucent Image has been changed to last the duration of Fade, instead of just the first few seconds, but its defensive value is nerfed by about half to compensate. Overall, this does feel worse, as larger DRs over a short period are typically better, but it does allow us to have about a 50% uptime of a 5% DR thanks to improved Fade taking the Fade CD down to 20 seconds. Now we have some fun new additions to look at. First off being Void Tendrils. Void Tendrils is a 20-second breakable 5-target root within 8 yards of the Priest, and while its melee range and target cap makes it a bit awkward, it's still a great addition to see added to Priest's toolkit. We also have 2 PvP talents, Void Shield and Void Shift, coming into the PvE toolkit. The first being a way to refill your Power Word Shield until it is fully removed, though it doesn't reset the duration of the buff. And the latter being a niche but potentially incredible healing and trolling option, which allows you to swap health percentage with another player. The one awkward thing about Void Shift right now is its 5-minute cooldown does feel a little bit long as a PvE talent, and I would like to see that brought down at least in PvE. Looking at more defensive options, next up we have Spell Warding, a nice 3% magic DI to pick up if you have the extra points to reach it. And the last 2 major defensive options to talk about are Angel's Mercy, a reduction on Desperate Prayer's CD based on the damage taken, and a nice addition if it wasn't for the awkward path to reach it, and Angelic's Bulwark, a somewhat lacking option which gives a 50% health shield whenever you fall below 30% on a 90-second CD. We will also be gaining the ability to cast Holy Spells in Shadow form, giving us access to many of the off-healing spells in the class tree without giving up a necessary stance for the rest of our kit. And while hard to reach currently, I want to look at one of the new holy spells in the class tree, Holy Word Life. This spell is a huge shield to targets under 20% health and potentially one of our best off-healing pickups if we can find a way all the way down to the bottom left of the tree to grab it. That's about it for major points I want to cover in the class tree. As I said, overall this class tree feels much better, though there's still a few points I'd like to cover that could take this from a great class tree to an excellent one. First off, and this links to the spec tree as well, there are still quite a few utility nodes in the spec tree that feel untouched due to comparable throughput options, namely Silence, Psychic Core, and Dispersion, which feel like they would fit a better role in the class tree. Secondly, outside of a few potentially powerful nodes, the left side of the tree still feels very unimpactful to Shadow. I understand that it shouldn't be immediately attractive to a DPS, but currently it's hard to imagine ever wanting to touch many of those nodes, some of which block off potentially powerful talents such as Spell Warding and Holy Word Life. Before we take a look at some of the new spells and talents we've gained, I want to talk a little bit about Void Form and some of the changes made to Void Bolt in this patch. Voidbolt CD has been doubled to 9 seconds base, and while an increase to the CD felt necessary with the current iteration of the spec, 9 seconds feels much too long for the spell to still feel impactful, especially when it is also losing its identity as our major dot extender thanks to another talent that we'll cover later. Another thing we start to see is that Void Form is once more being pushed closer towards just becoming a mastery applicator with a bit of percent spell damage. Once more moving further away from the iconic form of the spell many of us associate from back in Legion and BFA. While I agree that moving that playstyle away from being central is good for the spec overall, if they do want to keep Void Form around, I would love to see it as something closer to its old form as opposed to the shell we currently see. While not a perfect solution, I look towards the Ravenous Frenzy playstyle Boomkins currently have on live, and I believe what that CD currently is what many of us would want from both Void Form and Surrender to Madness. That feeling of ramping haste as we tap into this ancient unknown power, slowly losing control as we delve deeper into the void. One of the most anticipated aspects of the spec going into Dragonflight was the removal of Searing Nightmare, which we finally see realized in this iteration, and with its new profile for an AoE Insanity Spender. Mindset has changed from an AoE builder into a spender, and while we do see some issues coming from losing our only spammable ranged AoE spell, it is a much cleaner AoE solution than Searing Nightmare ever was. While we still need to see some tuning coming across for the new Seer, since it is able to spend a full bar of Insanity in around 2.5 GCDs of channeling, as well as being disconnected from the infinite resource generation of Searing Nightmare's cast while casting design, it has much more potential to be the busty AoE finisher that Shadow has lacked for multiple expansions now. Along with a new finisher, we see 2 AoE dot applicators added into the tree. First, we see a change to Shadow Crash, allowing it to apply Vampiric Touch to 4 targets, though I'm sure many of us wish it wasn't tied to Shadow Crash specifically. We also see a return of Dark Void, a talent in BFA that causes an initial burst of damage while also applying Shadowwood Pain to multiple targets. While we still need to see some polishing for these 2 abilities, an AoE dot applicator is a great pickup for the kit, especially with so many new dot interactions and ways to extend them. Next, we'll talk about what is one of the best additions to the tree, Mental Decay. This talent allows ticks of both Mind Flay and Mind Seer to extend our Vampiric Touch and Shadowwood Pain on targets, taking over Voidbolt's place as our dot extender. While in single target it may feel like a less impactful but much wanted change to avoid a few GCDs every 20 seconds, in AoE this has massive implications of allowing us to once more manage multi-dotting on a large number of targets through a combination of the AoE extension in Seer and the AoE dot applicators in Shadow Crash and Dark Void. This also synergizes well with the potential dot-based AoE burst coming from Idol of the Zoth. Speaking of our dots helping in AoE and cleave, we see some new support to a fan-favorite cleave effect, Shadowy Apparitions. Tormented Spirits comes as a nod to the past Spirits iteration, where ticks of pain cause a spirit to spawn when critting. This iteration is a very small chance per tick, and instead of going onto our pain targets, it funnels back into Vampiric Touch targets after being procced by a pain tick. In addition, thanks to the new multi-target touch applicator in Shadow Crash, we also see an easier way to get dots out and start spawning a ghostly army and cleave in AoE scenarios. Sadly, as much as I would love for this to be a mainstay for our AoE and cleave, without much more support, it will likely just be a passive benefit for our other playstyles. One of the most interesting talents coming into the new spec tree is an old spell that I'm sure no one expected to see again, Mind Spike. Coming back closely to its WAD iteration, Mind Spike is a small burst of damage after a GCD cast that extinguishes any dots you have on the target, while also buffing the next Mind Blast you cast with a stacking 30% crit chance. Anyone who remembers the spec from back in WAD will remember that this, along with Clarity of Power, created a Dotweaving playstyle that was very polarizing for the community. For those that don't remember, I'll cover it and some more possible playstyles revolving around this talent in a bit more detail when we talk about potential playstyles. Along with Mind Spike, we receive 2 major talents that synergize with it, Mind Melt and Surge of Darkness. Currently, Mind Melt reduces Mind Blast cast time by 50% per stack, a very underwhelming effect for a single instant cast after 2 casts of setup, which makes it feel much more like a worse version of Vampiric Insights while adding another interaction to manage in the spec, leaving it feeling a bit lacking. On the opposite side is Surge of Darkness, which gives Vampiric Touch and Devouring Plague a chance to cause the next Mind Spike to not consume your dots, stacking up to 3 times for 3 uses. Due to the heavy dot interaction in the rest of the kit, this feels necessary to make Mind Spike truly flow well into the rotation. Going into Dragonflight, we also see an old CD reforged, as well as a new old passive damage talent that doubles as an activator for it. Dark Evangelism comes back as a purple variant of its Cata form, giving a 10% passive buff to our non-periodic damage. Then, when it's time to step up with some immediate burst, Dark Ascension comes in, trading those passive stacks for up to 20% damage onto our non-periodic effects. There are a few things that still feel off about Dark Ascension though. Currently, it does have a cast time, which goes against Blizzard's philosophy of cast times typically having some immediate effect, and the requirement of building up and giving up Dark Evangelism stacks adds even more time for our CD setup. Add in the fact that with Void Form and this being easily accessible together, it creates a cast sequence where we use 2 GCDs, both of which mostly just give % damage to enter our CD rotation. The last specific set of talents I want to look at are 3 unimplemented nodes on the left side of our tree: Shadow Orbs, Puppet Master, and Harness Shadows. While we have no idea how these talents will play out yet, we do see that Shadow Orb shares the name of an old Kata talent, which gave our periodic effects a chance to increase MindBlast damage, while also increasing our periodic damage afterwards. While we have no idea what these talents will pan into yet, it's important to note that they are one of the 2 lines leading into Mindbender, which if nothing else is always a desirable 1-node talent to give us some extra insanity generation during CDs. Now that we've looked at some of the new additions, let's take a chance to talk about some of the issues we still see in this new spec tree. One of the major concerns for Shadow is button bloat, as it currently has one of the larger collections of commonly used spells in its rotation, and between the new talents being added, the chance of specking to some talents that used to be exclusive, and a rework to our off-healing with the introduction of holy spells, we are potentially gaining quite a few more headed into Dragonflight. Another heavy point of contention, one shared with the first iteration in Alpha, is that our tree has a lot going on but lacks focus on many of those aspects. One of Shadow's problems in recent expansions is how many different avenues the spec contains, all trying to fit together in a coherent shell. And with the addition of Mind Spike and its dot clearing aspects, we now see these potential playstyles at direct odds with one another. While I think that type of friction can see success in this version of talent trees, currently these playstyles lack any real focus in the tree, and instead each playstyle finds the nodes that complement it tangled within the other playstyles spread all throughout the tree. A problem closely akin to the lack of focus in the tree is some weird pathways to get to some of what should be our most influential talents, the idols. It feels like to get to any of the 4 void idols, you go through multiple nodes which contribute nothing to the idol they lead to, making it seem like you have to potentially put dead points in just to access the capstones we should be excited about. On top of these seemingly unrelated pathways into capstones, the entire next to last row of our tree is a wall of unimpactful 2-point nodes, each of which feels incredibly weak per point to be filling out the bottom of our tree. We still see some more utility-focused talents included in the spec tree, and while a few utility options to grab without giving too much up is fine, we still find Silence and Dispersion and their resulting nodes afterwards at direct odds with picking up throughput talents. Now that we've talked about some of the changes in beta from both live and the first iteration, let's get into some of the possible builds that come from the new talents. The first couple setups I want to look at revolve around the new talent Mind Spike, and let's start with the most controversial one, Dotweaving. While it is unlikely that Dotweaving makes a full return, the potential playstyle is still one I want to talk about. This is a playstyle that will most likely see single target use if it does make it back into the game, outside of some cleave potential of Psychic Link. The essence of this playstyle is dividing the spec into 2 vastly different windows, one of which revolves around instant damage through Mind Spike and Mind Blast while filling our resource bar, and the other becomes a dot window where we rely on our dot interactions and stacking as many DPs as possible before clearing dots to enter the non-periodic window with Mind Spike once more. While this playstyle doesn't sound necessarily bad, the big issue is that it turns off most of our kit's interactions both through dot-based talents and our mastery for a substantial portion of the rotation. It also goes against one of the most iconic themes for Shadow, making us much less reliant on the constant dot damage that has typically defined the spec since Classic. Another very unlikely single target scenario to be worried about is a world where our dots are completely pushed out in favor of the Mind Spike Mind Blast interaction. While this seems even less likely than Dotweaving currently, there are some other factors that could support this, and this could become a more coherent idea if there was a supporting section of the class tree that focused more on non-dot interactions. The most problematic part of a playstyle like this is it not only pushes our mastery completely out of the spec, outside of possibly Void Form, it also drops our only true single target spender in Devouring Plague. This next playstyle is the first one I think is likely to come from the rework, and one that can see promise in all content from single target to cleave to a cleave-based AoE and M+. One of the current defining interactions we have is ShadowFlame Prism and Mindbender, giving us a high focus on Death and Blast whenever we have our Bender up in its 1-minute CD window. There are 3 key differences we feel in this interaction compared to live though. First, the loss of our tier set will likely see an overall decrease in the amount of blasts we have within a Bender window. Second, due to the change in Death and Madness, we see extra deaths available within the Bender window in Execute. And lastly, but certainly not least, is the new talent Fiending Dark, which will reduce the CD of Bender by 2 seconds for every Mind Blast and Mind Spike cast. To do this interaction with MindSpike, there's a world where this synergizes extremely well with the Dotless MindSpike build. However, for much the same reason I don't see a no-dot build coming forth, I doubt this build would be allowed to reach live servers without some large oversight or changes to our mastery and insanity spinning. The more likely version of a SFP build that could come from what we've seen on beta is identical to live, but with just a slightly lowered CD, still relying on Void Form for blast resets as a 2-minute CD with power infusion. While it is not currently interacting this way, it's also possible that Dark Ascension will work with ShadowFlame Prism's instant damage, giving a new burst CD to feed into Binder windows. The largest concern is for Binder to naturally align with the 2-minute CD. Dark Fiend will need to reduce Mindbinder to either 40 seconds or 30 seconds on average, which does look very likely with the amount of MindBlast and MindSpikes currently in the rotation. Talking about the live playstyle, this next one feels much more like our current live rotation, though without SFP, leaving it as mostly a single target option. This playstyle revolves heavily around the Surge of Darkness procs, allowing for MindSpike to be used with many aspects of our current playstyle, but outside of waiting for these procs, not much really changes from the current live rotation. It's mostly centered on MindBlast damage buffed by some dot aspects such as Insidious Ire, the talent implementation of Tabardar Stratagem, and our mastery. It shares the same base priority as the current live rotation, while also paying attention to some extra maintenance buffs such as Dark Evangelism. The largest difference comes once you have passively gained some Surge of Darkness procs, where you then want to consume them using MindSpike to buff the next cast of MindBlast, making sure that any other MindBlast damage interactions are also active during this burst. You'll also notice that the main burst CD will likely become Dark Ascension, adding an even larger burst to this non-periodic combo. We've talked about Blast and some of the things that interact with it for a single target. Now let's talk about a returning Cleave talent that shares a similar activator. Physic Link comes back with a little bit extra, now gaining a new spread interaction with MindSpike, and is looking like a possible Cleave definer with potential M+ as well. The key thing to note is that while MindSpike will take the dots off the current target, it is very unlikely that it will strip the dots from other linked targets. This means, tuning pending, we may see a world where in Cleave or AoE scenarios, we keep one target without dots up just to funnel MindSpikes into, before swapping to another dotted target for a mastery-empowered MindBlast, which adds yet another wrinkle in our historically complicated multi-target rotation. Another fun new talent to look at for this lane of Cleave is Pain of Death, which is a very similar effect to Psychic Link, however it spreads our Shadow Word Death damage instead. The last thing I want to talk about is another one I don't think, or at least hope won't hit live servers, and easily one of my biggest fears looking at both the first iteration of the tree and this new one. A world where Flay reigns supreme. While this new tree has less direct interaction with Flay itself, we still see quite a bit of periodic value, especially through Dark Evangelism. On top of this general increase to periodic damage are 3 talents directly buffing both Flay and Seer. We've already talked about Mental Decay, and the second to look at is Monomania, which increases the tick rate of dots on the main target of both spells. The third is the return of Eternal Call to the Void as the Idol of Cthulhu, which causes channels to spawn Void Tendrils, which will channel a copy of the spell which procced it and passively generate Insanity. While this idol currently doesn't work with Mindseer due to the Insanity cost added to the spell, it is likely it will gain the old Mindseer channel in a future build. There's also one final channel-related spell that interacts with only Mindflay Insanity, which causes Mindflay to gain 80% damage for 5 seconds after a Devouring Plague is cast, which can be snapshotted if casted at the end of the buff window. And this talent alone gives a huge fear to a talented channel spec and single target. While how much of this we use is dependent on tuning, currently these Flay Insanity ticks are uncomfortably close to a similar MindBlast cast. Even if this doesn't stay the case, however, the idea of more power into our channels runs us back towards one of the issues with castwall casting. Any window that makes us want to channel, especially in a small buff window with its current snapshot interaction, passed just as a very weak filler when nothing else is up, makes both movement and the need to cast any utility spells feel much more punishing. Talking about having to move or cast utility spells, due to some of the added passive Insanity generation through Maddening Touch and Idol of Cthulhu, I also have fear of a world where we find a target count that allows Mindseer to be close to self-sustaining, leading us towards one of the larger problems of Searing Nightmare, making us into a turret spec in AoE once more, though the lack of a setup GCD to spend will still feel much better than back then. That's about all I have to cover for the new iteration of our talent trees. Overall, it's a huge improvement over the first iteration, especially with our class tree going from one of the worst to what I believe is a solid A tier from a DPS perspective. While there is still more work to bring our spec tree to the same level, we start to see a much better core to iterate on here, which gives me hope in the coming months leading up to Dragonflight's release. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the new tree, and just a reminder to post any feedback you have onto the forums for the devs to see. If you have any questions about my opinions here or just Shadow in general, I usually stream around 8 Eastern, Tuesday to Sunday if you ever want to stop by.